I wrote something about this in uh, on X, on an X post. I'll put that below. It was provoked by. Let me say something for a second because I think of it. Since I'm doing these things extemporaneously, we're always hearing a specific phrase from the European Union, Russia's unprovoked, and from the Atlantic Council in America, Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine. Um, the reason for that is because in legal usage, there's a difference between an attack and a provoked attack. So they deliberately tried to present it as the strong version, the unprovoked attack, which is obviously a faulty charge. Now, whether the provocation is sufficient to the decomposing of the provocation by the what was initially the SVO and what would have ended differently had it not been responded to by the Western powers is another question. But there's certainly, let me say that way. I would want to state the case that way. It's dishonest to say it's an unprovoked attack in order to shut down the legal discussion on how much provocation was there and was it did it justify anything like the SVO or the invasion. But okay, let's forget about that. But I was provoked by Zizek's a Substack post. Zizek is hysterically putting out the Substack post, his interpretation of Kafka's Das Urteil begins the post. So, well, what I was thinking with that hysterical thing is just that it's rather nice little trope of reality, as it were, that the organization that has Zizek's name on it, some kind of Zizek Studies Institute, something, the guy that runs it says, we don't go by the living Zizek. He's an hysterical guy, but some of Zizek's old writing when we founded this place is what we're interested in. But in any case, Zizek, the currently actually biographically, zoologically living Zizek, is putting out a lot of articles on Substack in a hysterical raid, and one of them mentioned Das Urteil, and then it mentions him according to this notion of the father in this discussion, in this Das Urteil, the judgment, he says is a picture of a weak father. So I think this is typical of the radical left political tact, is always to take up and make this determination of any strength is in a direct way, like Gavin Newsom and Robert Reich are using this argument to say Trump is weakness masquerading as strength. But what they usually say is that if there's some kind of overt bursting into anger or cruelty or something, anything excessive, that this is actually not a sign of power but a sign of impotence. This is the constant argument. And then so correspondingly, according to this father that shows ostensible cruelty to the protagonist is then put down as Zizek as weak. So let me argue against that. And first of all, Kafka begins the story, as he often does, with the bare suggestion, sort of poetically suggested, that we're not dealing with Athenian version of Galilean Newtonian block universe that we could just look at as into the biologist Hamilton's fish tank, as it were. The biologist Hamilton suggested that he could see that the biological world was sort of like a fish tank where, the Cambrian explosion, whatever, God sort of pokes into the fish tank and stimulates some kind of evolutionary event. It begins with these words that are translated as he's sending this letter to his friend that lives in Russia, and it says in a sort of dreamily fashion he seals it, but the actual words, I looked it up, is in Spielrischer how is this Langsamkeit, in playful, in a playful manner, in playful slowness, in playful slowness, so, or languidness, or torpor or something. So it's almost like, I see where they get dreamy from, because it's almost like in a playful, torporous sluggishness, he's putting this letter to the Russians into the envelope, and then it sort of suggests sleep, just as at the beginning of the trial when he's talking about the slander that Joseph K. somebody must have slandered Joseph K. or badmouthed him because he woke up to find himself arrested by ICE or whatever. Which, of course, in Kafka's world is the same as in our world. It's sort of like you find yourself arrested, but it doesn't. Your reason doesn't agree with it most of the time. So, arrested could mean, let's extend that as a metaphor all the way to mean anything that happens to you arbitrarily, which you despair of having any power over to change it. Somebody changes the locks in the apartment you live at, and then you have to go and get the new lock, even though it was no doing of yours or whatever, and it doesn't seem like you should have had to go through all that trouble, or anything in daily life which seems that we can't retrieve the former, as it were, natural state that should have, the optimistic Ermutigung mood that we should have had were it not for the necessity coming down on us. But I think, anyway, I just wanted to say Kafka always Kafka often opens things in this sort of poetic, suggestive fashion where we don't really know what he's trying to suggest, and people like Gambit give us some idea. But it's also sort of the smokiness, the Rauch, Neo Rauch painting, which suggests intoxication and suggests the Kabbalah and mysticism. And in other words, that the question whether God exists or doesn't exist doesn't even arise. One lives directly in the fable, as it were. So we're entered into this fable. I would start there, and then I would say, so I would say my interpretation on the whole is the Russian friend was actually the proponent himself, but it was him as when he's in this mood of being the iconoclast, or the Gauguin, or the Wim Wenders, or whoever. What's the other guy? The poet that works with Wim Wenders is very good, the left-handed woman. But Handke, Peter Handke. But if one is this how do you say, bohemian figure. Um, then it's as though one had deliberately said, I'm not going to go with the Republicans or the Democrats. I'm going to be instead an artist. And that's what this Russian guy is in the full sense. And then if you think of statements by Carl Jung, for instance, I think one of the most quoted statements by Carl Jung, there's, scores of them, but one amongst them is the statement that the creative scientific mind that goes out further to the furthest outpost will always be isolated, that the fate of the great thinker of whether it's I think Jung was, when I read that, it was a long time ago, but I always thought it was Jung was kind of thinking of himself, because he did complain on certain occasions that basically, aside from his discussions with Freud, but there it was a question. Actually, that's interesting. Aside from his discussions with Freud, he never had a prolonged exchange with somebody who he thought was at equal level. He only had discussions with, intellectuals or people that were basically like people that quoted an encyclopedia to him but weren't the real thing. But the thing about Freud is there's an analogy there with young Freud with the young Socrates. There's two. It's confusing because there's a character who appears at the same time as Socrates called the young Socrates. But I mean Socrates when he was a young man, imagined by Plato as meeting Parmenides and Zeno. And there we could say Socrates as pictured in the Parmenides is not as its full development. So in a certain sense, Jung was only after he broke from Freud got to his full development. So we might think that in the Parmenides, Plato suggests that only through breaking through Parmenides and Zeno and their discussion on the one and the many as it's still perhaps according to sort of, if you follow Diogenes Laertius and the way he talks, he says that before Socrates everything was about fuses or space, about the exterior. And then with Socrates, we got into these so-called ethical discussions. So you could kind of see maybe this is the same thing as with Jung saying, before Freud, he never brought this thing to the head where he said, we can't really make this bulwark against the black tide of mud, against the cold. We can't really present psychology. I mean, it's usually said in terms of, Freud would only wanted to found everything on a theory of sexuality, whereas Jung said, no, the unconscious carries more than that, and dreams aren't only about the royal road to sexual hang-ups or something like that. But I think stated more fairly to Freud, one would say that the whole theory of psychoanalysis amounts to saying in the biological evolutionary, because remember Freud copied Ernst Haeckel with the recapitulation theory and things like that, within this way of thinking, within this way of understanding the world as fuses as the exterior, as space understood in evolutionary biological terms, there's certain things we can't. At that time, they didn't have the advanced psychiatric drugs we do now, but they didn't want to handle it that way anyway. There's certain things we can't simply exhort you to snap out of, but we think that there's ways that we can, as it were, not rationally in the sense of Socrates, but rationally in the sense of the logic of recapitulation and the logic of things happening in the early youth, and then undergoing some kind of sublimation or individuation, such that they're maybe imperfectly worked into the being of the person. We could go look into and then show you how they happened, and then through seeing it, then you would snap out of it, rather than being persuaded or being exhorted into doing it, being yelled at or something. So that there's this scientific notion that it was found, and Jung basically said, broke from that and said that's not founded on just the biological notion, because Jung said the way Jung talks about it is in Kantian terms, like that when he was younger, he was a Kantian who thought you couldn't break the sphere, as Cassirer put it in his debate in Davos with Heidegger. You can't break out of the sphere of the phenomenon, taken in the Kantian sense, where the phenomenon is the object of the sense of the senses. But you see how that makes sense, because there could be an object of the senses, but it's in a million forms that don't necessarily have to correspond to the physical object understood as the object of basic physics, understood as what you get in experiments about electromagnetism and whatever the latest, supposedly most rarefied particles are. So that's the same thing as the two tables of Eddington. But what Jung is saying is, he discovered through his investigations, no, we could push past this duality of the phenomenon and the supposed scientific reality. And in the same way, I think, we get that in Das Urteil. If instead of interpreting it in Zizek's way, what we do is we think, this Russian friend is the side of this guy. So think of the conversations you have with people. Sometimes you have a conversation with somebody, say it's an older person or whoever it is, that you can't express yourself the way you're really thinking, but you have to subordinate yourself to the expectations of that situation, of that topos, of that place, and maybe all your optimism and all your Ermutischkeit or encouragement comes from being in that topos, in the being part of it, being solitarily identified with it. And so that there's part of this character that Kafka is showing is the one who's sending the letter, who's fulfilled all the normal necessities of life. But then part of Kafka is this super isolated Nietzschean Zarathustra character, in a way, up on the snowy peak or whatever, and walking around saying, don't these people realize that God is dead, and showing the lantern in the daylight like Diogenes or whatever, doing or putting their feet in a bucket of ice water and then writing down the first thing that comes to their mind, or some kind of automatic journey to the unconscious, upon which the so-called negritude movement was founded. I mentioned, by the way, that guy actually said he really didn't like that name for it. He thought it was kind of a soft name. He wanted to say, but I won't say it. He wanted to say something more explicit there. But Trump has recently said didn't he say there's two N-words and they're both not supposed to be said? Something with this military thing. But in any case, as long as we're sort of trudging about in this region, which is the break from the liberalism. So we're, in a way, Freud is the liberal and Jung is the one that sort of breaks from the liberal. In a way, Parmenides and Zeno are the ones that Socrates has to kick loose of, and no longer only... See, Socrates goes away from the suke, and he goes to this. He goes away from. Actually, he goes away from fusis, or the space, which Hegel is still obsessed with, and he goes. If you look at the Jena logic, Hegel bases his whole system on sort of saying space is the exterior nature, and what the statements he makes at the beginning of the later logic, the short statements on being, basically follow this notion of space as being the foundation then for time. And then Bergson reverses that. But just, I mentioned this, so that just sort of in passing. But we're in a situation where, and Nick Land, when he's going to interview with, I'm not saying he's interviewing Dugin, but when he's having a discussion, being a co-discussant with Dugin, let's say this way, he's involved in, let's hope, when he's involved in dialogic with Dugin. As mentioned, there's also this problem with the unclarity about time. Specifically that one can't say that the current time was produced by the past time, because the past time is if you just draw it on a chalkboard, you say this is the current time, make a circle, and then if you were to talk about the past time, that would have to be something else. And then if you're saying the past time is the one that caused the current time, you're stuck in talking about something else that's not there and is really not the cause of it. And just like if you say the current time is the cause of the future, draw a third circle, it's always seems to be the one circle, and then, but this is already known since Aristotle though. So, Aristotle makes some remarks about maybe in this sense, we're at the same time as the Trojan War, the circularity of time. It's just that things are changing in the way that objects that cast shadows change spaces, which, by the way, is still kind of Newtonian physics is like that, only the quantum physics isn't like that. But once we see that this Russian friend, so for instance, there's evidence for my interpretation is the Kiev incident, which the father is said to have even approved of the thing the Russian friend said and to have repeated it himself. So the father was sometimes impressed by the second personality, the artist personality, and he repeated this notion about some things that happened in Kiev that impressed him. I wrote something about that in the X post, which I'll, as I mentioned, I'll put in the notes. Although it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, it's not, of course, exactly what's said in the text. But the whole thing, I'm putting the interpretation and the text, sort of mushing them together. But when we get to the moment where the father finally tells him to go drown himself, which seems so cruel, and by which Zizek then says, oh, this is a sign of the weak father. I think this is the interesting point where we get to the Kabbalah area, where we get more serious, is we're no longer talking about the Bohemian as against the conformist, where the conformist is always double, because there's the conservative and the progressive conformist, or the right and the left conformist, or the Democrat and the Republican conformist, or different, whatever. Although it can, of course, flip around, because the right wing could want to be totally unconservative in the sense of trying to keep things the same and be rapidly moving forward in some way, but towards what they call it right, because it's in the direction of the view that a disciplinarian can show results, something like that. Whereas the left is tends to be of the view that there must be no physical punishment of the children or something like that. And that everything they do wrong must be regarded as requiring of some kind of be restored through something more scientific rather than through the rod, or whatever the rod suggests in a more general sense, the strict culture, or the firmness of the governors. But outside, so this whole type of way of saying, oh, there's these different positions among the normie freaks or whatever, or among the political masses, or among Das Mann or whatever. This way, I'm saying it misses what Kafka is actually showing in the story.